Hi, it's Kevin May, Editor-in-Chief of PhocusWire. So, Kei Shibata, Rod, Cuthbert, welcome. Kei from Venture Republic and Rod from Rome to Rio. You've just been talking on the main stage in there about lessons from Asia. We talked about some other lessons from Asia, and I just wondered, Kei, I mean, the investment sector within Asia Pacific, so SoftBank is the one that gets talked about a lot, investing in Western companies. What's your general view on the kind of the investment markets and the kind of companies that they're looking at and where?
Well, the SoftBank is a very special investor, first of all. So I think they totally came out of the box. Yeah. So they're not looking not only Asia but also all over the world, right? Yeah. So they are basically just putting eyes on some of the late stage, like really growing startups everywhere in the world, and some of them happen to be in India, yeah. Some of them happen to be in China. So, but they are not really seeing themselves as an Asian investor, I think.
Right.
So and the Masayoshi-san he's a genius investor.
Why is he a genius investor?
Looking back at his history, he made so many great investment decisions, including Yahoo Japan, most notably Alibaba, right? Yeah. So I think he was actually thoroughly into this investment business after he was seeing the huge success in Alibaba. That actually triggered him to be more into the investment space than running their own business. And then he actually see the features very well, I think. He's what he talks about, singularity. I think that's what he always talk about. And then and then also I think he understands the game is changing. I think I saw the slide that I think the Maggie was showing on a stage. I think it's the number of the startup is actually, the founding number of the startup is actually decreasing, but at the same time, the amount of investment is actually is going upwards, right? So he saw the trend. I think he saw that the winning startup is actually going to win more. So he just made a huge bet, which is actually a very smart move, I think.
I mean, I was talking to Fritz yesterday here at the studio, and he was acknowledging also that there's been this kind of squeeze on middle level rounds. So Series A and Series B have kind of narrowed a bit, and people are generally going for the Series C, Series D rounds. This is the investors, rather than at the kind of the nascent level, the early stage. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's because of the technology innovations, what actually changing even faster now. So if you are able to build the global scale startup, you can actually scale even quicker now. So that's probably the reason why I think there's the huge difference between the big giant startups and then small startups. No one in the middle.
No one in the middle. Where would you consider Rome to Rio to be then now? Are you in the middle, or would you still say you're early stage or not?
We're definitely early stage. We've been very selfish with our equity. We value it highly, and we haven't wanted to bring in outside investors, but we're at the stage now where we've got so many projects that we'd like to get started. Projects require engineers and capital generally, so we're preparing to go out to the marketplace.
Within that marketplace, do you sense, Kei and I were just talking about this kind of squeezing of the next level of rounds at all when you're talking to people?
No, well, what I perceive is that if you've got an interesting company, an interesting management team, and an idea that people buy into, there's investors out there. And I think particularly for businesses that don't have a tight regional focus but have a global opportunity, I think that's particularly interesting to investors.
And you have a global opportunity, and you consider yourself to be a global brand, correct?
Yeah, oddly, only 3% of our business comes from Australia. We're really a European business based in Melbourne, Australia. yet our fastest growing sector is Asia, and we haven't spent any time. So all these anomalies in our business that we enjoy, but we better get our heads around them quickly, I guess.
Okay, so I mean, we've seen more recently that some of the big Asia Pacific established travel brands are now buying into Western brands, which is kind of flipped from what was happening 5, 6, 7 years ago. You had Expedia and Elong and things like that. It's gone the other way. Is that because they just have the ability and the capital to do that, or is it something else?
Well, absolutely. I think our capital situation is definitely the one, right? I think it's the world now is actually, it's just so many capitals out there, and then particularly in Asia, particularly in China, and they are like definitely imbalance out there, right? And then, but the second thing is actually the information can be spread so fast, so much in depth now. So anyone can see, some successful company out there somewhere in the world, they can actually catch up. Right? What's happening? What's the secret of success? There's almost like no secret of success these days, I think.
Okay.
This is,
maybe that's a bit disappointing if there's no secret.
Well, yeah. So I think so. We within our management, sometimes actually our management team, sometimes we actually have a debate how we actually going to hide the information.
Right. Okay.
And then it's getting harder and harder.
Okay.
But I think sometimes actually it works well if you take the strategy as a submarine, right? You kind of go under waters, and then all of a sudden, if you just go off, above the water, once you feel like, oh yeah, maybe we can actually talk about it.
Okay.
Because the background is, the information out there. It's so easy to replicate. I think that's probably the reason why, like Chinese startup, for example, they are doing great job in looking around the world, what's going on, and then what's the technology or what's the business model they can apply to, right?
Yeah.
So that's my analysis.
So I suppose one of the big ones was C-Trip bought Skyscanner, which I think kind of makes a lot of sense now. At the time, it was fairly left field. It's like, okay, that's interesting. But they've also recently bought Trip.com, which was formerly GoGoBot.
Right.
I mean, that was a surprise, that one. Would you agree, Rod?
I think it was a surprise to me because it used to be in the early days of the internet that people would pay a lot of money for a domain name. And we haven't seen that for a long time.
And you're thinking maybe we have now?
Look, I think there's plenty of value in GoGoBot or Trip.com as they renamed themselves when they bought the URL. I think that was the principal asset that C-Trip bought, and I think it's a really smart move. But I just smiled because I'd forgotten about people paying tens of millions of dollars for domain names, and this was it was a throwback.
Right. Fly.com was one a couple of years ago. That was, I think that was 1.2 million. But Trip.com presumably cost a little bit more than that.
I think 10.
Right. Okay. So, you're saying you're an international company. Your focus is on Europe, but you're growing in India. How have you ever identified how to grow? Is it just because Europe's got this terrific rail network and that's where you started, right?
Yeah, we started in Europe because of the complexity of the transportation network. And the deregulation of the coach networks was happening there. So between any two European cities, there's half a dozen really good ways to get there. You could fly, you could take a high-speed train, a regular train, a coach, ride share, or you could drive. So there's 6 ways. And even if you live in those cities, it's hard to stay on top of what the relative journey times, costs, benefits, pros and cons are.
But do you think if you'd perhaps looked at China first, you might have caught the attention of C-Trip?
I think China, the Asian markets are just so complex for a Western company that it's too high a mountain to climb to think that you can come out of a Western marketplace with our way of looking at the world and think that you can do best first in Asia.
Yeah. I always think it's quite interesting because, we referenced Expedia buying Elong and stuff like that. And I remember the three of us being at web and travel conferences, and there would be sessions about, if you're a Western company, this is how you need to think about Asia if you're going to expand into Asia. You don't get that anymore because it's gone the other way. So what do you think, is that kind of market now closed to Western companies to try and target Asia Pacific, just because there are so many powerful companies there already now?
Look, Booking.com have done tremendously well by making investments and by buying Agoda. What a terrific idea that was.
And they invested in Ctrip.
Invested in Ctrip, but with Agoda, their model of celebrating the company, of leaving it independent, it keeps its name.
But that's quite a few years ago now.
To me, I think the most interesting deal happened in the region was the Expedia bought the Traveloka in Indonesia.
So yeah,
that was like, to me, I think that was probably one of the most significant deal for global brands, Western global brands, actually to buy the Asian brand, because I think Expedia was clearly seeing the big threat in the Southeast Asian market. They have been in Asia for a number of years, but I mean, we just talk about the local tigers versus global elephants. And then that's a clear example, like a local tiger. It's definitely marching, definitely doing so well. Then Expedia felt that okay, so we should actually, have them actually including in our group, right? So
and Indonesia is the next one, isn't it? Arguably of that kind of the really large populated countries to kind of reach that
it's
kind
it's
of
a
online.
next India, or maybe the Indonesia can be the next India. But I want to kind of go back to the the Ctrip Skyscanner and the Trip.com thing. To me, I think it was a very smart decision for Ctrip because of the difference of business models. So the Ctrip is clearly the OTA, but they understand very well about the different business model, including meta search, because they acquire Tuna, right? And then what's happening in the meta search space right now, as far as I understand, because we've been in the meta search space for 17 years, is we started seeing more limitation in a meta search business model, because especially on a mobile, the user experience on a meta search.
So it's the instant book element to it.
It's just becoming awkward and more outdated, and then the user acquisition game is actually harder and harder. So on a marketing front, as a meta search, we have to compete with the OTAs, and the OTA has a higher margin. So I think, I don't know what the Gareth Williams also thinking, but he was probably, it's probably natural for me to think about, like, why don't we actually move into transaction space? And then the Ctrip thinks that, okay, so the Skyscanner has a great reach to the, in the world, and especially in the Western world, and then, they think that, okay, maybe this is a great fit in strategies. And the last part was actually the content, which is actually coming from Trip.com, right? I think what they're looking is also the content, and the content is a very powerful way to acquire the users, also covering the upper funnels.
So further up, you're saying?
Yeah, and then also in destination too.
Yeah. Let me just bring Rod in here. Kei's comments on Meta, and that's your wheelhouse, isn't it?
What would you like me to comment on?
What do you think about what he's saying about meta search, and it's changing because of the mobile experience when you're sending people off to a different site? How are you tackling that?
Look, the big issue in Meta is that Google are trying to make it all go away.
That's another thing. Yep.
Google's engineers want the customer to get from their first interaction to their purchase as quickly as possible. And their view is that the best way to do that is using just Google products. So bad news for Skyscanner and Kayak and Rome to Rio and anybody else that's playing in that game.
Okay. That's quite a downbeat assessment. I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, you know, we really only use Meta for air. We're an OTA for ground transportation. So, but frankly, Google want to have a piece of that pie as well. So
Yeah,
I think the
that's true.
industry has this existential threat hanging over it.
I think we are in the transition time, you know, as a meta search. If either, you know, you really focus on a geographical market or some verticals, or, you know, you add more functions, you know, you kind of, you know, like a graduating the league of a meta search and then become OTA or become like a content player or something else. So that's the fundamentally, you know, the fundamental shift going on right now, I think.
So we'll wrap up. Quick fire question then. What do you think would be the next deal?
Next deal.
Yeah. You first, and then we'll finish with Rod. Name some brands. Come on.
Yeah, I don't think the Asian buyers will deviate much from what's happening globally. So the two areas that are hot now, tours and attractions. So we've seen the big Fair Harbour purchase by Booking.com, and there's some interesting young companies in Asia that are focused on that sector. So I think they're hot properties. And then I think that ground transportation is getting hotter as people become more aware of rail and the other forms of ground.
Okay.
Okay, so I just mentioned, you know, what's most amazing thing happening in Asia, that is the local mobile internet sort of messenger apps.
Right.
That includes WeChat, Line, and Kakao. So those three messenger platform combined, there is the 1.3 billion users, very active users.
Just a few then.
Right. And then they are all getting to travel now. So means I wouldn't be surprised to see some of those names actually going to buy some travel company in near future.
Okay. Right, there we go. So thanks as always, Rod. Thank you, Kei.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you very much.